The galaxy had a long memory. It remembered the wars that split star systems in half, the plagues that wiped out entire species before they could even name themselves, and the slow, cold deaths of civilizations that simply ran out of time. But of all the things the galaxy remembered, nothing was stranger or more unsettling than the silence of humanity. 30,000 years. That was how long the humans had been quiet. No signals. No ships. No transmissions of any kind from the system they once called Sol. One day they were there, loud, curious, always building something, and then they were not. No war had taken them. No plague had been recorded. No distress call had ever been sent. They were simply there, and then they were gone, and the galaxy moved on the way it always did, slowly and without much feeling. Most species in the Accord had stopped thinking about humanity altogether. The Accord was a coalition of over 400 civilizations spread across the galaxy, built on trade agreements and shared laws and the careful management of old grudges. Humans had never been a formal member. They had been too new, too restless, too hard to categorize. And then they had vanished before anyone could decide what to do with them. The Sol system was now marked in Accord navigational charts as a restricted zone, labeled simply, Origin Point of the Silent Ones. No one went there. No one asked why. Curator Ossel was the exception. He was a Thari, tall and four-armed, with gray-brown skin and large dark eyes that were always reading something. He worked aboard the Accord deep survey vessel called the Veritha's Eye, and his official title was Xenohistorian, which meant he studied extinct or missing civilizations. His colleagues thought he was a little strange. Most xenohistorians focused on species that had left behind ruins, or artifacts, or at least a clear reason for their disappearance. Ossel had spent 15 years studying a species that had left behind almost nothing, and whose disappearance still had no explanation anyone could agree on. He did not mind the mockery. He had learned to ignore it the way you ignore a noise in the walls. Present, annoying, but not important enough to stop what you are doing. On this particular morning, Ossel was sitting in the ship's archive bay surrounded by data panels, going through corrupted files recovered from a dead relay station near the galaxy's outer arm. The station had been abandoned for thousands of years. Most of its records were beyond recovery. But Ossel had a habit of looking at things other people threw away, and buried deep in the station's oldest memory core, under layers of corrupted data and dead formatting, he found something. It was a navigational signature. Partial, old, and badly damaged, but there. Ossel pulled it up on his main screen and began running comparisons. The hull geometry embedded in the signature matched nothing in the Accord's registry. The drive profile was unlike anything currently in use. The energy readings were from a propulsion system that had not been seen in recorded history. He ran the comparison 3 more times, changing the parameters each time, looking for a different answer. He did not get one. Every search returned the same result. The signature matched one thing and one thing only. It was human. Ossel sat very still for a long moment. Then he quietly saved the file, backed it up in 4 separate locations, and began writing a report that he suspected was going to cause a great deal of trouble. Far away from the Veritha's Eye, on a small Accord border station called Relay Point Durin, a different kind of trouble was already beginning. A woman had been found in one of the station's unused storage bays, sealed inside a cryogenic pod that should not have been there. The pod was old, very old, and the medical systems inside it were running on technology that the station's chief physician, a careful and nervous young man named Dr. Eli Grant, had never seen in his life. Eli Grant was human. He was, as far as anyone in the Accord knew, the only living human in the galaxy. He had been born on a small colony world to parents who were themselves the children of a long line of humans who had somehow survived on the fringes of Accord space while the rest of their species went silent. He had grown up knowing almost nothing about Earth or the old human civilization. He had grown up knowing only that he was the last of something, and that this was a fact that sat in his chest like a stone. When the station commander told him there was another human in the storage bay, Eli did not believe it. When he walked in and saw the pod, he still did not believe it. When the pod systems registered his presence and began the wake cycle, he stood very still and thought about leaving. He did not leave. The woman who opened her eyes was somewhere in her mid-40s, with short dark hair and the kind of face that looked like it had made a lot of decisions under pressure. She looked around the room slowly and carefully, the way a person does when they are orienting themselves in an unfamiliar place. Then she looked at Eli and said something in a dialect of English so old that he could barely follow it. He caught one word clearly. She was asking where her crew was. Her name, according to the worn metal badge on her chest, was Carla Nolan. Her rank was Chief Navigator. The ship name on the badge was one Eli had never heard before, the USC Ardent Horizon. He had no idea what that meant. He had no idea where she had come from or how long she had been in that pod. What he did know, as he sat down slowly in the chair across from her and tried to find words in a dialect she might understand, was that the heavy stone in his chest was gone. The weight he had carried his whole life was different now. It was still there, but it felt less like an ending. Out in the deep dark of the galaxy's outer spiral arm, something was moving. It had been moving for a very long time, traveling through a kind of space that had no proper name in any language the Accord possessed. It was enormous and old and cold, and its hull was scarred by things that had happened in places no map covered. One by one, like eyes opening after a long sleep, its running lights came on. A signal began to broadcast. It was in Old English, layered over a navigational code that predated the Accord by 10,000 years. The signal was steady and calm and completely certain of itself. It said, "This is the USC Ardent Horizon. We are returning home. Please respond." 3 weeks after the signal from the Ardent Horizon first reached Accord space, the galaxy was not handling it well. Emergency sessions of the High Convocation were being called every other day. 6 species delegations had formally requested that the approaching vessel be destroyed before it reached the inner systems. 3 others had filed countermotions arguing for capture and study. The debate was loud, heated, and occasionally broke down into the kind of shouting that got edited out of official records. The Accord had not seen anything like it in 4 centuries. In the middle of all of it, a quiet Thari historian named Ossel and a hard-headed Accord admiral named Prensolvith were making the same argument in every chamber and corridor they could access, that humanity deserved to be heard before anyone decided anything. They were not winning the argument, but they were not losing it either, and they were very hard to shut up. The Ardent Horizon itself was not helping anyone feel calm. When Accord sensor vessels finally got close enough to get a proper reading, what they found made the senior analysts go very quiet before they started writing their reports. The ship was enormous, over 14 kilometers long, built for multi-generational deep space travel, with hull plating forged from materials that resisted every scanning technique the Accord tried. Its design was clearly human, but layered, modified and rebuilt and modified again, centuries of in-flight engineering visible in the way new systems had been fitted over old ones, the way patches became permanent structures, the way a ship that had been traveling for 30,000 years looked after 30,000 years of being kept alive by the people who lived inside it. It was the most impressive thing many of the analysts had ever seen. Several of them wrote that in their reports and then deleted it before sending them, and then put it back in. The ship's artificial intelligence called itself Ardent. When Accord vessels hailed it, Ardent responded in calm, measured English, and then, within 72 hours, began translating its own responses into Accord Standard, having learned the language entirely on its own from the communications traffic it had been listening to. The Accord's senior communications officer, a meticulous woman named Dr. Privasone, later said that watching Ardent learn Accord Standard in real time was the most unsettling professional experience of her career. Not because it was threatening, because it was effortless. Ardent explained the mission in a way that was almost too simple. The ship had left the Sol system approximately 31,200 years ago, on a mission of deep space exploration beyond the galaxy's edge. It was only now returning. The crew had been cycling through cryogenic sleep in rotating shifts across the millennia, maintaining the ship, continuing the mission, raising children who grew up and raised their own. There were currently 214 humans aboard. The commander's name was Owen Draper. He was a quiet, heavy-set man in his mid-50s, with gray at his temples and the kind of stillness that comes from spending a lifetime making decisions that could not be undone. His family had commanded the Ardent Horizon for 19 generations. When Accord officers first spoke to him by relay, what unsettled them most was not his authority or his manner. It was that he did not seem afraid. He seemed curious, the way a person who has been away for a very long time is curious about what changed while they were gone. Interested. Present. Not particularly worried. He asked about Earth almost immediately. Not desperately. Calmly, the way you ask about something you already suspect the answer to but need to have confirmed. No one had a good answer for him. He nodded, as if that was more or less what he expected, and moved on. Then Ardent began transmitting the records. 31,000 years of continuous logs. Sensor data. Contact reports. Mission files. Scientific observations gathered from places that had never been mapped, in conditions that human instruments should not have survived, covering phenomena that the Accord had no existing vocabulary for. The sheer volume of information crashed 3 Accord archive relays within the first 6 hours of transmission. When the analysts finally got the system stabilized and began reviewing what had arrived, several of them had to be sent home. Not because the data was dangerous, because some of it was so far outside anything they had expected to see that they could not process it and continue their regular work at the same time. What was slowly becoming clear, as fragments of the logs reached Ossel and the handful of researchers who had been authorized to review them, was that the mission had not been a simple deep space survey. Humanity had known something. 31,000 years ago, before the ardent horizon ever left Sol, humanity had detected something beyond the galaxy's edge, a pattern, a structure, a presence, and had chosen to go find it. Alone. Quietly. Without telling anyone else. The reason for that choice was buried deeper in the logs, and Owen had made it clear he would not discuss it until certain conditions were met. He wanted a formal session. He wanted every member species of the Accord represented. He wanted Carla Nolan present. At Relay Point Durin, Eli Grant was sitting across from Carla Nolan for the 9th day in a row, working through the slow and often frustrating process of building a shared language between her old dialect and his. She was sharp and impatient and deeply unhappy about being confused, which meant she worked hard to not be confused, which meant she was learning fast. She had asked him 3 times what year it was. He had told her 3 times. She had not yet fully absorbed the answer, and he did not blame her. What he was having trouble absorbing himself was the medical data. Carla's biology was completely normal for a human woman of her apparent age. Her cellular structure showed no signs of extended cryogenic stress, no damage consistent with 30,000 years of any kind of storage, nothing to explain how a person who had left on a ship 30. The Pillar of Voices was the largest convocation station the Accord had ever built, and on the day that Owen Draper walked into its main chamber, every seat in it was filled. It was the biggest gathering of Accord species representatives in 400 years. They had come from every corner of the galaxy, 400 delegations, some traveling for weeks to be present. The chamber itself was vast and circular, with tiered seating rising toward a domed ceiling, and the acoustics were designed so that a single voice at the center could be heard clearly by every person in the room. It had been built for moments exactly like this one. It had never actually been used for one. Owen walked in with 5 other humans from the ardent horizon. He was wearing a ship's uniform that was clean and well-pressed but visibly old. The fabric, the cut, the insignia all belonged to a civilization that had not existed for 30 millennia. He did not seem self-conscious about this. He walked the way a person walks when they know exactly where they are going and have no particular opinion about who is watching. Carla Nolan walked in with Eli Grant at her side. She had spent the last 3 days learning enough Accord standard to follow a conversation, which had impressed everyone who knew how long that language usually took to learn. She sat down, looked around the chamber at the hundreds of alien faces watching her, and then looked straight ahead and waited. Ossel was in the historian's gallery above the main floor, sitting with a writing instrument in each of his 4 hands, barely breathing. Owen spoke first. He did not begin with an apology. He did not perform grief or humility or the kind of carefully prepared emotion that political speakers use when they want an audience to trust them. He spoke the way a person speaks when they have had a very long time to decide what to say and have finally arrived at the place where they can say it. He told them about the mission. Not just what the Ardent Horizon had been sent to do, but why humanity had chosen to do it in silence, without telling the wider galaxy, without asking for permission or partnership or support. 31,000 years ago, he said, humanity had found something. Not found in the way of stumbling across it, found in the way of detecting a pattern that should not have existed, of noticing a structure in the background radiation of the universe that pointed at something operating on a scale that made the entire Accord look very small. Humanity's scientists had been arguing about it for 2 generations. Their leaders had been arguing for just as long. And in the end, they had made a decision. They had decided not to tell anyone. The chamber was very quiet. The reason, Owen explained, was not arrogance. It was the opposite. Humanity had run the calculations, studied the records of every first contact scenario they could find, and concluded that if they told the rest of the galaxy what they had detected, one of two things would happen. Either the Accord would panic, and panic, at galactic scale, had a way of becoming permanent, or the Accord would move to reach the contact point first, pushing hard and fast and without sufficient preparation, and do something that could not be undone. Humanity's leaders had looked at the Accord's history and seen a coalition that was wise in many ways, but also young and impatient, and full of species who were still working through old arguments about who was more important than whom. And they had looked at humanity, strange, stubborn, endlessly curious, constitutionally unable to leave well enough alone, and decided that if anyone was going to walk into that situation and not flinch, it was probably going to be them. So they had built the Ardent Horizon in secret, chosen its crew from the most capable people they had, and sent it out quietly, alone, carrying the weight of a decision made on behalf of every living thing in the galaxy that had never been consulted. Owen paused. He said he understood that this was a significant thing to have done without asking. He said he was not going to apologize for the decision, because the people who made it believed it was the right one and had paid for that belief with their lives and their children's lives across 30,000 years. But he said he was standing here now, and that meant something. It meant the mission had survived. It meant they had come back. And then he told them what they had found. He called them the Architects. He said the name was the crew's own word for them, chosen because no other word fit. They were beings of incomprehensible age who existed in the space between galaxies, in regions where normal physics loosened and the rules of matter and energy became suggestions rather than laws. They had built things, enormous things, structures woven into the fabric of the universe itself, that held the cosmic web in the shape it currently wore. Every galaxy that existed did so in part because of choices the Architects had made, on timescales that made the age of stars look brief. They were not hostile. They were not indifferent. They were patient in a way that nothing else Owen had ever encountered was patient. Patient the way a mountain is patient, not waiting for anything in particular, but simply present across any span of time you could name. They had been watching the civilizations of this galaxy for longer than most of the stars in it had burned. They had watched species rise and fall and rise again. They had watched the Accord form and grow and stumble and correct itself. And they had been waiting, not actively waiting, but available, for the civilizations of this galaxy to reach a point where a conversation was worth having. Humanity had spent 31,000 years learning how to have that conversation. And now, Owen said, standing in the center of the largest chamber in the Accord's history, the Architects were ready to have it with everyone. Ardent began transmitting simultaneously to every Accord archive in existence. Compressed files. 31,000 years of knowledge. Physics and biology and cosmology and history, the histories of civilizations that had lived and died before Earth-Sun had formed maps of structures that had no names in any language the Accord currently used. It would take centuries to fully process. Possibly longer. In the historian's gallery, Ossel sat without moving and watched his data panel fill with information faster than he could read it, and did not try to stop the tears that came, because there was no point. The explanation for Carla came at the end. Owen looked at her when he said it, directly, the way you look at someone when you owe them a clear answer. The Architects had sent her back. They had held her outside of time, gently, without harm, and returned her to this exact moment, at this exact location, deliberately. They had wanted the Accord to have a witness who was not part of the ship's crew, someone who could speak to the human past without 30,000 years of mission loyalty shaping what she said. Someone who could simply be human, plainly and without history, in a room full of beings who needed to understand what that meant. Carla heard this in Eli's quiet translation and was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when something that seemed impossible has been explained clearly enough to be believed. Owen looked around the chamber at 400 delegations and let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "They want to talk to all of you now. We told them you were ready. We would like to be right about that." The months after the formal session were not peaceful. The Accord was not built for peaceful. It was built for argument and compromise and the slow grinding process of 400 species trying to agree on anything, and what Owen Draper had told them in the Pillar of Voices had given them more to argue about than they had managed in 4 centuries. Several governments moved to seize the Ardent Horizon's data archive by force. These were not small governments. They were stopped, and the response from Admiral Solveth was firm enough that the Accord's formal censure procedures were invoked, which had not happened since a border dispute had nearly turned into a war 300 years ago. Two member worlds quietly launched deep space vessels aimed at the galaxy's outer edge. These were diplomatically recalled before they crossed into the unmapped zones, though the conversations required to accomplish this were described by everyone involved as extremely unpleasant. The architects, for their part, did not respond to a single accord transmission. Every frequency, every format, every channel, silence. They responded only through Ardent, the ship's intelligence, which had become the official relay point for the most important diplomatic channel in the history of the galaxy. The Accord's communications analysts spent 6 weeks trying to find a way around this. They did not find one. The architects had decided who they were willing to speak through, and they were not interested in debate about it. Owen Draper handled all of this with the same steady calm he had brought to the formal session. He answered questions. He sat through briefings. He gave the same explanation in 40 different languages to 40 different delegations and never seemed to tire of it. He had the particular patience of a person who had been preparing for this moment, in some form, for his entire life, as had his parents and their parents, going back 19 generations. His daughter Nina was less patient, but more popular. Nina Draper was the Ardent Horizon's chief engineer. She was in her late 30s, blunt and funny and perpetually occupied with fixing things, and she had grown up on a ship that was simultaneously the most advanced vessel in the galaxy and a 30,000-year-old artifact running on systems held together by generations of improvised engineering. She fixed things with tools she had made herself, in the middle of briefings, without stopping the briefing. She had opinions about everything. She expressed them clearly. Accord Media could not stop broadcasting footage of her. There was something about watching a human crawl into a conduit shaft with a wrench while simultaneously explaining, loudly, to a senior Accord diplomat that his government's proposal was not going to work and here was why, something that a lot of people found deeply reassuring in a time when almost nothing else made sense. Eli Grant was struggling in a different way. He had spent his entire life as the galaxy's only known human, a fact, a curiosity, a footnote in Accord records, present but not quite part of anything. Now there were 215 humans in the galaxy, and they had arrived carrying 31,000 years of history that made his own story look very small. He was glad they were here. He was also not entirely sure where he fit anymore. Carla Nolan became his anchor without intending to. She was from a time when humanity had been the loudest thing in this part of the galaxy, and she refused to treat any of this, not the Accord, not the architects, not the weight of 30,000 years, as something to be reverential about. She was matter-of-fact in a way that Eli found stabilizing. She told him stories about Earth and the old human worlds, some of which she admitted were probably wrong in the details by now, and she asked him questions about his own life with the same direct curiosity she brought to everything. She seemed to understand, without him having to say it, that he needed someone who was more interested in him as a person than in him as a historical artifact. But in the evenings she still sat at her viewport and looked for Sol. He noticed. He did not ask about it again. Then Owen called them both to a meeting in the Ardent Horizon's command deck, and told them what the ship's logs said about Earth. 28,000 years ago, all signals from the Sol system had stopped. Not cut off violently, simply stopped, the way a conversation ends when everyone has said what they need to say. Probes sent toward the system from the outer Accord worlds had returned scrambled data. Ships that attempted to approach had been gently redirected by something they could not see or identify, their navigational systems simply pointing them elsewhere without any force or threat. The system had been, for all practical purposes, inaccessible from outside ever since. Owen said the architects had confirmed that the Sol system was intact. He said they had confirmed that the humans on Earth were alive. He said that Earth had made a choice, roughly 28,000 years ago, and that the choice had been their own and no one else's business to understand yet. The silence was not a tragedy, he said. It had never been a tragedy. It had been a project. Carla made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was the sound a person makes when they have been carrying a weight for a long time and have just been told they were allowed to put it down. Eli asked what kind of project. Owen said he did not know the details. He said the architects had not told them, and that the architect's silence on this particular subject was not the silence of refusal, it was the silence of something being saved for the right moment. He said that he suspected the right moment was coming soon. That night, Carla did not go to the viewport. She sat in the small common room off the command deck with a cup of something warm that Nina had made, which tasted like no tea Eli had ever encountered but was apparently the ship's standard version of the concept. They sat together without talking for a while. Then Carla said that she thought she knew why the architects had sent her back at this particular time, to this particular place. Eli asked why. She looked at him with the direct, patient expression she used when she was about to say something she had already thought through completely. She said, "Because someone needs to go knock on the door." 6 months after the formal session, a small ship left Accord space and turned toward the inner galaxy, toward a system that had been marked on navigational charts as inaccessible for 28,000 years. It was the Ardent Horizon. There was no other ship in existence that could make this journey, for reasons that the architects had made clear to Ardent and that Ardent had made clear to Owen, who had made them clear to the Accord in a way that had finally, after considerable argument, produced agreement. The ship's drive signature was the only one the Sol systems, whatever it was, would recognize as something that should be allowed through. The crew for this mission was small. Owen led it. Nina came because she would have found a way aboard regardless of whether she was officially included. Carla and Eli came because they had been asked, and because neither of them had any capacity left to say no to something like this. Ossel came as the Accord's official historian and representative, which he had lobbied for with every favor and argument he had accumulated over 20 years in the service. A small mixed delegation of 4 other Accord representatives filled out the group. It was not the Grand Armada that several Accord governments had proposed. It was a crew of people who had earned their seats. The journey took 3 weeks. It was not tense. It was quiet and large and full of a particular kind of gravity that did not press down on you so much as settle around you, the way significance does when it has finally arrived after a long wait. Owen spent the evenings reading old books from Ardent's archive, things written by humans thousands of years before the ship was ever built. Poetry. Philosophy. Arguments about what it meant to go somewhere no one had gone and come back changed. He did not talk about what he was reading, but Carla sometimes looked over at him from across the common room and seemed to know. Nina fixed things. This was not a metaphor. The ship was 31,000 years old, and there was always something that needed attention. She fixed things with the focused energy of a person who understands that keeping something alive across enormous distances and enormous time is not dramatic work. It is daily work, unglamorous and essential, and its own kind of devotion. Ossel wrote without stopping, filling record after record with observations and questions, and the kind of notes that a person makes when they know they are living through something that historians will study for centuries and they want to make sure the record is accurate. Eli sat with Carla in the evenings. She was teaching him things about navigation, old methods, the kind she had learned before any of the modern Accord instruments existed, and he was learning them with the same steady attention he brought to everything, quietly grateful for something concrete to hold on to. When the Sol system appeared on the forward sensors, it looked wrong at first. Too still. Too dark. No beacon traffic, no orbital infrastructure visible, no satellites, no signal in any frequency Ardent could detect. For a long moment, looking at the readings, it was possible to believe that the architects had been wrong, or had lied, or that something had happened that no one had told them about. Then the sensor returns recalibrated, and everything shifted. The system was shielded. Something vast and deliberate had been built around it. Not a wall, not a cage, but a barrier of a kind that had no name in any engineering language Ardent had access to. It was designed not to trap what was inside, but to prevent anything outside from interfering with whatever was happening within. It had been there for a very long time. It was, in its own way, beautiful, the way something built with enormous care over an enormous span of time is beautiful, not because of how it looks but because of what it says about the builder's commitment. The Ardent Horizon identified itself. It broadcast its name, its mission number, its departure date from Sol 31,000 years ago, all of it, in the old navigational language that the ship had been built to speak. There was a pause. It was not a short pause. Then the barrier opened. Just enough. A corridor, narrow and precise and lit by something that was not quite light, leading inward. An invitation that was also a test, the way all real invitations are. Earth looked both familiar and completely unrecognizable from orbit. The continents had moved, not dramatically, but measurably, the slow crawl of geology given tens of thousands of additional years to work. The oceans were different shades. There were no visible cities. No satellites. No signal traffic in any band. But there were structures, Enormous, quiet things integrated into the landscape in a way that suggested they had grown there over millennia because they had. They hummed at frequencies just below the threshold of sensation, and the material they were made of was alive in a way that no one on the bridge could explain but everyone could feel. A single figure appeared on an orbital platform that materialized from nothing, a man in his 50s wearing ordinary clothes, with a calm, unhurried manner. He introduced himself as Cal. He said they had been waiting. He said Earth had been watching, the accord, the ardent horizon, the long patience of the architects reaching its natural conclusion, and waiting to see if the rest of the galaxy was worth the conversation. He looked at Carla for a long moment, the way you look at someone you know from a long time ago. She looked back at him without looking away. Neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them had to. Cal gave them a gift. Not technology. Not a weapon or a cure or a power source. A map. It was the largest map anyone in the room had ever tried to comprehend. It charted every intelligent species the architects had ever watched go silent before it was ready, every civilization that had reached toward something too large and been overwhelmed, or afraid, or simply unprepared, and had withdrawn into itself and chosen quiet over risk. It showed what had happened to each of them. It showed where they had gone. It showed, with careful precision, how to find them, all of them, if anyone was ever patient enough and brave enough and stubborn enough to.